Missing wife showed up at my doorstep at 4 a.m., but I'm convinced that it isn't her. My wife Michelle thought it would be a good idea to get one of those doorbell cameras. This was because one time I caught the neighborhood pervert outside our window watching my wife get her back blown out by my brother-in-law. So we bought the camera and I installed it the same day right up by our porch lights so that we could get a view of the front door and as much of the front of our property in the shot as possible. No suspicious activity has been recorded until Michelle decided to go on a business trip to Miami for 4 days. She was supposed to be home last night around dinner, but called to tell me that she had to finish up some extra business meetings and said she'd be back no later than 4 a.m. I told her I loved her and I'd see her when she came home. It was an average night. I straightened up the house for her because I was the housemaid while she worked. I went to sleep around 2 a.m. I'd only slept a little over an hour before I was woken up by an alert on my phone, a notification for the security camera. Now it wasn't unusual to get an alert, especially late at night. It was always some little critter, a fox or raccoon, but I grabbed my phone off my nightstand to check anyway. It was well after 2 a.m. and my immediate thought was that Michelle had gotten home earlier than she thought she would. I lay there listening for the sound of Michelle letting herself in, but it never came, only silence. I groaned, figuring she'd forgotten her keys. Wouldn't be the first time. She was notorious for leaving them behind. So I opened the app and pulled up the live feed. Michelle was standing on the front porch, just staring at the door. I sat up, about to go let her in, when something stopped me. It was her face. She was smiling. Not just any smile, but one that I'd never seen before. A weird, thin-lipped grin that stretched the width of her face, like someone trying to show off all of their teeth. She stayed that way for a long moment, like a creepy mannequin. After a minute, her lips slowly puckered out into a pout, as though she were an upset toddler. She held that expression for a minute, then her lips dropped downwards, and a deep-set frown etched across her forehead. I sat there in bed, staring at my wife, practicing different facial expressions as if she were brand new at such a concept. It was bizarre and a little unsettling. She continued to go through each movement, seeming to take her time with each one. Smile, pout, frown, repeat. After watching her for nearly 15 minutes, I finally recovered from my shock and confusion and pressed the intercom. "Babe, what on earth are you doing?" I said. Her head snapped towards the camera, looking up at it with wide eyes. It was as if she had forgotten the camera was even there. Her mouth was partially hanging open on one side, caught between a smile and a frown. She didn't answer me, only continued to stare, her face frozen in that disturbing look. I waited for a long moment, unsure how to proceed. The longer I watched her, the more I realized just how strange she looked. I didn't notice at first, being half asleep, but now that I was wide awake, it was so obvious that I wondered how I could have not noticed immediately. For starters, she seemed much taller. She was a Latina baddie, so she was only like 4'11", but this woman was as tall as goddamn Shaquille O'Neal, WNBA looking ass. And that wasn't the only odd thing about her. Her arms were much too long, hanging down past her knees. Even her face was different. It resembled her, enough that it wasn't instantly noticeable, but when I really looked, I could see that her face seemed more narrow, as if it had been stretched from the top of her head to her jaw, and the skin looked too tight, as if it were 2 sizes too small, the bones underneath pushing hard against the flesh. I was beginning to panic at that point. I didn't know if she'd been in some horrible accident or what, but I knew something was very wrong with her. "Honey, are you hurt?" I asked, my voice shaking. In response to my question, Michelle stamped her foot down on the porch, hard, shaking her head. Before I could say anything else, she reached out and took hold of the doorknob and jiggled it fiercely. I was instantly filled with dread at the mere thought of her getting in. "I'm not letting you inside," I said quickly. I could hear her jiggling the knob frantically, her face still staring up at the camera. She finally let go after a few minutes and made a sound almost like laughing. The sound of it made my skin crawl.
"I'm home. Open the door."
Her voice, like her face, was similar, but not a complete match. I almost closed the app and called 911 right then and there, but I'll admit, I was afraid my wife was having some sort of medical emergency. Then something happened that will stick with me for the rest of my life. Michelle, or the thing that was desperately trying to be her, seemed to stretch right in front of my eyes. Her torso thinned out and grew so that her head slid against the ceiling. Its skin looked so tight that I could actually hear it pulling, wobbling, and rubber-like. It had obvious trouble staying on 2 feet, but it managed. It tried to close its mouth, but it couldn't do it completely, and its jaw just sort of hung there against its chest. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, fear overwhelming me. Her face twisted in a look of pure hatred. It was like I could feel it radiating through the screen. I'd never seen such hate and rage in my life, certainly not on my wife's face. Quick as a flash, she dropped down onto the porch and crawled down the steps and onto the lawn. I watched in horror as she crawled towards the field, her long arms bent at sickening angles. She reached the edge of the field and disappeared in the tall grass. I sat, watching the screen, my heart racing. I was too afraid to look away even for a moment. After an hour without seeing her again, I finally felt safe enough to set the phone down and try to sleep. I thought about calling my wife, but part of me was too scared I'd hear that poor imitation on the other end. I fell into a restless sleep sometime later. I didn't sleep long before my phone woke me again. I received another notification, this time at 4 a.m. I pulled up the app and held my breath, terrified at what I'd see. When the feed came up, I knew right away that I was looking at my wife. Relief flooded my body. She was standing on the porch, her suitcase at her feet as she rummaged through her purse, probably searching for her keys. "Lost your keys again?" I said, pressing the intercom. She jumped at the sound of my voice, almost dropping her purse.
"You're up,"
she said, smiling.
"Looks like I have lost my keys. Mind letting me in?"
she said, batting her eyes up at the camera. I couldn't help but smile. She always had a way of making me feel completely at ease, even after witnessing a nightmare just hours prior. "I suppose I wouldn't be a very good husband if I let you sleep on the porch all night," I teased. She grinned up at me and I told her to hang on. I sat up and slipped on my slippers and got to my feet. That's when I caught some movement on the screen. Far off in the field, a head rose up from the grass, standing tall on a neck much much too long to come from anything human. A whimper escaped my lips, and I nearly dropped my phone. I was glued to the floor, unable to look away from that thing watching my house. The head bobbed slightly, then the body rose upwards to meet the head, like a slinky sliding back in position. It stood in the field watching. Then, to my terror, it began shuffling quickly towards the house on jerky legs. I couldn't help but scream. It was coming for my wife, and it was coming fast. I ran down the hall, dropping my phone in the process, and rushed to open the front door before she could get attacked by whatever creature that was. I dragged my wife inside hurriedly, and she looked at me with extreme confusion and frustration.
What the hell, Cornelius? Is everything okay?
She said, "There was something outside about to attack you. We're safe now." After about 10 minutes of arguing and showing her the footage from our front door, I finally managed to convince her that I wasn't just being crazy. We ended up going to bed at around 6 a.m. and everything seemed fine, except when it hit 7:03 a.m. My eyes instantly opened like it was some sort of primal instinct. I was facing the outside of my bed and had this feeling that my wife was staring at me with an unshakable gaze. She was breathing heavily towards my direction. I could smell her breath all the way from here. I quickly glanced behind me to see if my instincts were true, and they were. Her eyes, they were open, but she was sound asleep and breathing as loud as an obese man on life support. I turned back to face the other side of the bed, and right when I did, my doorbell rang. I opened my phone, and standing outside my front door was my wife, but she actually looked like my wife more than the person at my door previously. Then it hit me, who the fuck did I let in?